The four Gospels that eventually found their way into the New Testament collection are ascribed by the Christian tradition to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These Gospels might have been preferred in part because by the 2nd century they had already been in use in important and influential communities. The tradition presupposed that they were all authored by persons belonging to the circle of Jesus' own disciples, or, as in the case of Luke, to the first generation of followers who joined the movement after Jesus' crucifixion. I will continue to use those traditional appellations, the Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John correspondingly, even if it's highly probable that the attribution to these prominent figures was suggested at a later stage, possibly as part of the effort to present them as more trustworthy and thus assure their canonization. We have already noted that in all probability the multi-staged process of Gospel traditions formation took a few decades. Therefore, when scholars offer their appraisal of the various Gospels' dating, they usually refer to the final stage of the process, that of the last substantial editing of the text. The dating one often encounters in the 60s of the 1st century for Mark, the 70s or the 80s for Matthew, the 80s for Luke, and the 90s for John. But of course, there are dissenting voices as well. It goes without saying, however, that the compositions in question can still contain earlier traditions, even those coming back to the days of Jesus himself. What will be especially relevant for us is the distinction between Matthew, Mark, and Luke on the one hand, and John on the other. The first three have received in the research the label Synoptic Gospels, from the Greek word synopsis, indicating the possibility of viewing a number of different things together, in parallel. It means that Matthew, Mark, and Luke may be arranged in three parallel columns, and they basically tell the same story with more or less similar order of events, and in many cases even identical wording. Besides these overlaps, however, there are also many differences, sometimes minor but sometimes meaningful. All this calls for attempts to explain how that synoptic variety came into being. It is the so-called synoptic problem. Similarities in structure and wording seem to indicate that the three Gospels represent offshoots of the same tradition, whereas differences may point to editing informed by different agendas and settings. Some scholars would see that shared tradition as an oral one, whereas others, highlighting the fixed wording, speak in terms of literary dependence. Whatever the case, the Gospel according to John seems to stand out as having a much freer hand in using the inherited synoptic tradition. We will see that it is much less obliged to that tradition's narrative structure and much keener in propagating the ideas of its author, which sometimes deviate from or even contradict those put forward in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.